he left her pregnant. 18 years later, their genius daughter takes the stage, and he finally learns the truth. Lillian Brooks was only 21 when her life took a turn she couldn't have imagined. Living in a tiny dorm room in downtown Manhattan, she was balancing fashion school classes during the day and working nights at a second-hand boutique to make rent. She dreamed of becoming a designer, someone whose name might one day be whispered on red carpets and fashion runways. She wasn't rich, but she was ambitious, and most of all, she was in love. Alexander Reed was everything Lillian wasn't. Older, confident, already successful. At 27, he had his own investment company, a reputation for aggressive but smart deals, and a Wall Street mentor who introduced him at every party like the next financial prodigy. He had brown eyes that saw through markets and charm that made him impossible to ignore. When he walked into the boutique where Lillian worked one rainy Thursday night, their worlds collided. She wasn't supposed to be on shift, someone had called in sick, and he wasn't supposed to be shopping. He was just there to kill time before a late dinner with clients. They started talking. A week later, they were inseparable. He took her to jazz clubs in Soho, surprised her with late-night drives to Brooklyn for pizza, and listened to her talk about her designs like she was already a legend. For the first time, Lillian felt like someone believed in her without needing proof. When she found out she was pregnant, she was terrified. But a small part of her was hopeful. Alexander always said he wanted a family someday. Maybe not right now, but one day. Maybe this was fate nudging that plan forward. She didn't wait, she told him everything over breakfast in his penthouse, her voice shaking, her hands pressed flat against her knees. He looked at her in silence, then asked for time to think. The next day, he disappeared. His phone number stopped working. His assistant said he was traveling indefinitely. No more flowers, no messages, no answers. Lillian was crushed. She called again and again, until finally, someone at his company told her bluntly, "He doesn't want contact." She didn't know that he had received a letter. A typed, cold letter signed with her name, but not from her. In it, the writer claimed the child wasn't his and that she had lied to trap him. The letter told him to walk away now and don't look back. The sender was his mother, Victoria Reed, a steel-nerved woman who had built a dynasty of money and control and didn't tolerate distractions, especially not from poor fashion students. Alexander believed the letter. Or maybe he chose to believe it. He didn't call her. He didn't ask questions. He walked away. Lillian was left alone. She thought of terminating the pregnancy. It would be easier. Her scholarship was already hanging by a thread, and her parents had cut ties when she moved to the city without finishing her business degree. But when she heard the heartbeat during her first ultrasound, everything changed. She moved out of the dorm, sold her sewing machine, and found a studio apartment the size of a closet in a town 3 hours north called Greenville. No fashion scene, no nightclubs, no familiar faces. She cried for weeks. She counted change for groceries. She stitched other people's wedding dresses in her living room just to afford vitamins. But she refused to give up. This child would be loved. This child would never feel abandoned. And no matter how much it hurt, she would never say his name again. Sophia was born on a bitter January night, when the snow outside coated the windows in thick, quiet layers and the hospital lights flickered once during a wind surge that nearly knocked out the power. Lillian had arrived alone, hunched in pain, her coat soaked and clinging to her knees. The nurse had asked gently if the father would be coming. Lillian only shook her head. She hadn't spoken his name in months. The delivery was long, exhausting, and raw. There were no flowers, no excited grandparents pacing the halls, no proud partner to cut the umbilical cord. But when they laid the tiny baby girl on Lillian's chest, everything else disappeared. She had blonde hair already forming at her crown, and when her eyes opened, they were dark, deep, unmistakably brown. Not her color. Not her family's. They were his. For a moment, Lillian couldn't breathe. She named her Sophia without hesitation. It was a name she'd always loved, strong and elegant. Sophia Brooks. No hyphen, no second surname. No trace of a man who had chosen absence. The days that followed were a blur of noise and silence. Sophia cried often and slept little. Lillian learned to function on 3 hours of broken sleep, feeding her between alarm clocks and freelance tasks. The apartment was still too small, with a heater that worked only if she kicked it twice on the side and begged. Winter air crept under the windows, but she bundled Sophia in layers of thrifted blankets and held her close during every storm. Sometimes she would whisper to her stories of a beautiful future where they lived near the ocean and had bookshelves that touched the ceiling. She didn't know if those dreams would ever come true, but they kept her warm. When Sophia turned 1, she could already hold eye contact longer than most toddlers. By 2, she was putting puzzles together faster than the daycare staff had ever seen. Lillian saved every milestone in a worn leather notebook, alongside sketches for clothing designs she never had time to make. She worked all day, picked Sophia up in the evenings, and stayed up late finishing bookkeeping for a local plumbing company whose owner paid her in cash under the table. Money was tight, always. Sometimes unbearably so. There were days when Lillian went without meals so Sophia wouldn't have to. She clipped coupons, shopped secondhand, and learned how to stretch a bag of groceries for a full week. But somehow, every time she watched Sophia laugh or read aloud from one of her picture books, it felt like life was still offering her something sacred. Her daughter was happy, curious, fearless. And that was everything. The town of Greenville was small and quiet, but the local library became their second home. The librarian, Mrs. Carter, noticed early how quickly Sophia devoured picture books and gently introduced her to science books made for older kids. Lillian used her breaks to research public school rankings and after-school enrichment programs. She couldn't afford private education, but she could build a path brick by brick. By the time Sophia entered elementary school, her teachers were calling her gifted. She was quiet but observant, kind but fiercely driven. She never asked about her father. Not once. Lillian wondered if she was waiting, or if she somehow already understood. Every birthday, Lillian gave her a handmade gift, a storybook sewn from fabric, a dress she tailored from scratch, or a shadow box filled with drawings of their memories. She had nothing expensive to offer, but she gave her everything that mattered. As the years passed, the apartment didn't get bigger, but their lives did. Sophia became the kind of girl other kids looked up to, not because she was popular, but because she was unafraid to be different. She joined the science club in middle school, started tutoring others in math by the 7th grade, and read medical journals for fun by 8th. Lillian watched with quiet awe. She had built a life on broken dreams and duct tape, but somehow, it had produced something golden. Her daughter was brilliant. And even though the world hadn't been fair to her, Sophia had turned it into something beautiful. By the time Sophia turned 17, she had become something of a quiet phenomenon in Greenville. She was the kind of student teachers talked about in the staff lounge, not just for her intelligence, but for the way she carried herself. She never sought attention, never bragged, never posted selfies or flaunted awards. Instead, she collected knowledge like others collected followers, and she carried herself with a grace far beyond her years. Her days were spent moving between advanced placement classes, volunteer tutoring sessions, science fairs, and late-night study marathons in the same corner of the local library where she had learned to read. Despite the weight of expectation, Sophia never appeared overwhelmed. She organized her time with military precision. Her room, though small, was covered in whiteboards, post-it notes, scholarship deadlines, and quotes she found inspiring. She lived in a world of equations, research papers, and quiet ambition. Yet, for all her academic focus, there was a softness to her, a warmth inherited from her mother. She made time for the shy students, stood up for anyone being mocked, and always thanked the janitors by name. It was her chemistry teacher, Mr. Dawson, who first noticed she was working on something much larger than a typical school project. In the back of the science lab, Sophia had set up a mini workstation where she was developing a biodegradable, low-cost filtration system using natural enzymes. Her goal, she explained to him one afternoon while cleaning beakers, was to create something that could be used in underdeveloped areas with little access to clean water. It had started as a simple idea for a local competition, but the deeper she dug into the research, the more determined she became to turn it into something real. Mr. Dawson, stunned by the depth of her research, submitted her project to a state-level innovation expo without telling her. When she won first place, representatives from national science foundations took notice. One of them, a woman named Evelyn Marks who worked with a network of philanthropic investors, introduced herself to Sophia after the ceremony and asked her if she had ever considered applying to the National Youth Innovation Summit in Chicago. It was an annual, invite-only event attended by university scouts, investors, and venture capitalists looking to support promising talent before they even entered college. Sophia had never heard of it. She smiled politely and said thank you, but the moment she got home, she spent hours researching it. She knew the cost of travel alone would be impossible for her mother to cover, but Lillian didn't hesitate. That same night, she took on another late bookkeeping client and applied for local travel grants. Within 3 weeks, everything was arranged. The trip to Chicago marked the first time Sophia had ever left the state. She packed her few belongings in a second-hand suitcase and carried her project components in a box reinforced with duct tape. Lillian couldn't afford to go with her, so she hugged her tightly at the bus station, her voice shaking as she whispered, "Whatever happens there, just be exactly who you are. That will always be enough." Chicago was a world unlike any Sophia had ever seen. Tall glass buildings stretched into the clouds, the air was electric with ambition, and everywhere she looked, there were people who seemed to radiate power and purpose. The summit was held in a luxury hotel ballroom filled with rows of booths, stage lights, cameras, and strangers in suits asking complex questions. For the first few hours, Sophia felt invisible. Her station was in a quiet corner of the room, far from the main presentation area. The booths closest to the center were crowded with students from private academies and international programs, kids who spoke confidently about multi-million-dollar startups and had mentors with famous last names. She felt out of place in her second-hand shoes and thrifted blazer, but she reminded herself why she came. When the judges arrived at her table, she spoke without notes. She explained the science, the scalability, the cost efficiency, and the potential for global impact. She didn't pitch herself like a brand. She simply told the truth. By the end of her demonstration, one of the judges looked at her for a long moment and asked, "Where did you say you're from again?" Throughout the day, more people came. Someone must have talked. A professor from MIT stopped by and left his card. A woman from a California institute asked if she would be willing to present at an international summit in the spring. A tech investor invited her to apply for a summer research grant. The buzz around her station grew, not because of flashy branding, but because the work was real. Sophia's project was different. It wasn't designed to impress, it was designed to matter. Late in the afternoon, while taking a short break near the refreshment table, she overheard a group of sharply dressed guests discussing the future of female inventors and the importance of early investment in talent. She didn't know that one of those men, standing with his back to her, dressed in a charcoal suit and nursing a drink, was Alexander Reed. Her father. He hadn't seen her yet. And she had never seen him. They were in the same room for the first time in 18 years, and neither of them had any idea what was about to happen. Alexander Reed didn't usually attend youth innovation summits. His calendar was filled with corporate boardrooms, international negotiations, and high-stakes tech investments. But this particular event had caught his attention after one of his firm's junior partners mentioned a growing list of unusually gifted students presenting real-world solutions. Reed Tech Ventures had recently launched a philanthropic wing focused on early-stage educational investments, and while Alexander rarely handled the outreach himself, something about this trip to Chicago had compelled him to go in person. He told himself it was for strategic visibility, a few PR photos, maybe one or two promising names to keep an eye on. What he didn't expect was for the day to take the sharpest turn of his life. The ballroom was crowded, pulsing with youthful energy, glassy-eyed ambition, and the low murmur of networking. He shook hands, nodded through introductions, and politely declined interviews. He wasn't in the mood for small talk. Something about the room felt heavy. Maybe it was the fatigue. Or maybe it was the sensation he got sometimes, in the quiet moments between meetings, that something was missing and had been for a long time. He was mid-conversation with a senior MIT advisor when he noticed a small gathering forming in one of the back corners of the exhibit hall. He might have ignored it, he usually did, but a familiar voice among the crowd caught his attention. Not familiar because he recognized it, but because of its tone. It was calm, precise, purposeful. Someone was explaining a scientific mechanism in a way that even a non-scientist could understand. His eyes drifted over, and that's when he saw her. The girl was standing next to a handmade display, nothing flashy, just neatly arranged research, diagrams, and a table holding a series of small filtration models. She was explaining something to a panel of listeners, and there was a subtle confidence in her posture, the kind that wasn't rehearsed or coached. Alexander couldn't say why, but his heart gave a strange, jarring tug. She had long blonde hair pulled back in a loose braid, and when she turned slightly to adjust her equipment, he saw her face clearly. For a moment, everything in him froze. Her eyes, deep, unmistakably brown, were looking up as she spoke to one of the judges, and Alexander felt something ancient and buried come clawing up to the surface. He stepped closer, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There was no mistaking it. Her features were hauntingly familiar. She looked nothing like him in structure, but the eyes. The shape. The quiet focus. The slight tilt of her head when she paused to think. He knew those patterns. He had seen them before, 18 years ago, in a hospital room he never visited, in a goodbye he never realized he had made. She looked like Lillian. He moved through the crowd, pulled by something he didn't understand. When he reached the edge of the group around her booth, he saw her name on the display, Sophia Brooks. Not Reed. Just Brooks. He staggered backward slightly, almost like he'd been hit. He hadn't heard that name in nearly 2 decades. He had forced himself not to. Lillian Brooks. The girl he had once loved, the one he had thought about countless times in silence, the one he had left behind after a letter arrived, cold, devastating, final. A letter that told him the child wasn't his. That she had lied. That she didn't want anything from him. But now, standing in front of this 18-year-old girl, Alexander realized something he had refused to believe for years. That letter had been a lie. He didn't need a DNA test. He didn't need confirmation. He was looking into the eyes of his daughter. Panic surged through him, colliding with guilt, shock, and something even heavier, grief. He had missed everything. First steps. First words. First day of school. Her whole life had passed without him. And now here she was, standing in front of him, brilliant and composed, and she didn't even know he existed. As the crowd began to thin, she moved toward the refreshment table, brushing past him without so much as a glance. Why would she look? He was a stranger. And then he saw her. Lillian. She was standing on the far side of the room, half hidden behind one of the tall banners, watching Sophia like a proud sentry. Her hair was shorter now, tucked behind one ear, and her posture was straighter, but it was her. The same Lillian he had fallen in love with, except her eyes now carried a depth and weariness he had never seen before. Their eyes met. It lasted only a second. But in that second, time folded in on itself. All the years he had pushed her out of his thoughts, all the pain he thought he had buried, all the choices he had defended, it all came crashing back with a force that nearly knocked the air from his lungs. She didn't say anything. She didn't cry. She didn't scream or run. She simply looked at him, as if daring him to move. Daring him to speak. Her expression wasn't cold, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was tired. Guarded. Alive with memories neither of them had ever confronted. He took a step toward her. But she turned away. Not dramatically, not angrily, just with the quiet resolve of someone who had spent too long hoping for something that never came. Alexander stood there, surrounded by success, by money, by everything he had ever thought he wanted. And all he could think was that he had lost the two people who might have given it meaning. His daughter was here. Alive. Extraordinary. And he was a ghost in her world. For the first time in 18 years, Alexander Reed felt the full weight of what he had walked away from. And for the first time, he didn't know if he had the right to walk back in. Alexander left the gala that night in a state of numb disbelief. He didn't stay for the keynote speeches or the closing reception. He didn't speak to anyone on the way out, ignoring the investors and journalists who tried to shake his hand or hand him cards. He barely remembered walking through the hotel lobby or stepping into the black car that waited outside. His driver asked if everything was all right, but Alexander just nodded, staring blankly through the tinted window as Chicago's lights blurred past. Nothing felt real. The city outside looked exactly the same, yet something fundamental inside him had shifted, and there was no going back. He spent the night in his penthouse suite, not sleeping, not working, just sitting in silence with a glass of untouched scotch in his hand. Thoughts came in waves, images of Lillian from years ago, the sound of her laugh, the day she'd told him she was pregnant. Then the letter. The paper he still remembered holding in his hand like a death sentence, each word designed to kill the future he hadn't even realized he wanted. At the time, it had seemed rational to leave. Logical. He had just begun making a name for himself, he didn't think he was ready for a child, let alone a scandal. But now, 18 years later, he understood that logic had been a mask. Fear had made the decision. And someone else's lies had sealed it. The next morning, Alexander did something he hadn't done in years. He returned to the source of the pain. He opened the locked drawer in his study where he kept old documents, files he never touched, pieces of the life he had buried. The letter was still there, folded and yellowed with time. He read it again. The tone, the phrasing, it didn't sound like Lillian. It was cold, without emotion or nuance. Something was off. At the bottom, the signature was typed, not handwritten. His stomach twisted. He called his former assistant, a woman named Angela who had worked closely with his mother during that time. When she picked up, he didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Angela," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Did my mother write the letter from Lillian all those years ago?" There was a long pause on the other end. Then a sigh. "I've waited 18 years for you to ask me that." The truth came pouring out. Victoria Reed, elegant, calculating, had intercepted the real letter Lillian had written, one full of fear, hope, and honesty, and replaced it with a forged message meant to sever all ties. She had seen the relationship as a threat to Alexander's future, an inconvenience he couldn't afford. Angela had known but stayed silent out of fear of retaliation. Now, after nearly 2 decades, the truth finally surfaced. Alexander hung up and felt his knees weaken. It was too late to undo the years, too late to return to the first steps or birthdays or lullabies, but maybe not too late to try. Not to fix it, because some things couldn't be fixed, but to show her, show both of them that he hadn't walked away knowingly. That he had been wrong, but not indifferent. That he cared. He tried to contact Lillian, but she didn't respond. Emails went unanswered. Calls never returned. It wasn't anger, he could feel it. It was protection. She wasn't shielding herself from him anymore, she was protecting Sophia. And he couldn't blame her. So he began from the outside. He anonymously funded the remainder of Sophia's grant through a silent donor agreement. He contacted the organizers of the summit and requested that her project be featured in their global newsletter. Through a former professor at Stanford, he secured her an invite to a specialized research program for high school graduates. Every move he made was strategic but invisible. No signatures. No announcements. He didn't want to buy his way into her life, he only wanted to make sure the doors she deserved were open. At night, he researched her work obsessively. He read every line of her published papers, studied the way she thought, and found himself stunned by her vision. Sophia wasn't just smart, she was revolutionary. She thought like an engineer, spoke like a humanitarian, and carried herself like someone who had never been told she couldn't do something. It was Lillian's doing, all of it. She had raised this girl with no help, no support, no safety net. And yet, Sophia had grown into someone the world was now fighting to invest in. The hardest part was staying away. He wanted to call her, to introduce himself, to explain everything. But how could he? What would he even say? I'm your father. I disappeared because someone lied to me, and I didn't bother to find out the truth. It wasn't enough. Apologies were easy. 18 years of silence were not. So he waited. He kept helping where he could, always anonymously, always cautiously. He arranged for her to meet mentors, scheduled lunches with women in STEM who could inspire her, and even pushed for her work to be submitted to a Global Youth Science Award committee. Every time he heard her name mentioned in an article or on a podcast, he felt a pang of pride and sorrow. Weeks passed before Lillian finally responded. It was a single line in an email. I know it was your money. I know you know. Do not contact her. He stared at the message for a long time. It wasn't cruel. It was clear. It was a boundary. And yet, that same week, Sophia sent him a LinkedIn request. He didn't know how she'd found him, or what she knew, or if the request had been accidental. But it was there. Staring back at him. He clicked accept. His hands were shaking. It was the smallest door. A crack. But for Alexander, it felt like air after drowning. For the first time since that night in Chicago, he allowed himself to hope. Maybe the road ahead wasn't closed. Maybe redemption didn't begin with grand gestures, but with presence, patience, and truth. Sophia hadn't expected anything unusual when she sent the connection request. It was a quiet, impulsive act, sparked more by curiosity than intention. She had seen his name mentioned in an article about anonymous donors supporting youth innovation, and while she didn't know exactly how she knew, something about the way the article described the man's involvement felt personal. She remembered catching a glimpse of him at the summit weeks earlier, a man in a dark suit with tired eyes, watching her booth from across the room like he'd seen a ghost. At the time, she hadn't thought much of it. But now, after a strange comment from one of the judges and the sudden momentum her project had gained in circles far beyond her reach, she started putting things together. The feeling that someone was watching out for her wasn't just intuition anymore. It was real. And she had a hunch it was him. When he accepted the request, she didn't message right away. She stared at his profile, scrolling past the impressive portfolio, the university credentials, the list of companies he'd built from nothing. There was no mention of family. No photos. No personal details. The man was all business. But the silence in his biography felt louder now. She kept her discovery to herself for a few days. Her mother had been more tense than usual lately, coming home from work quiet and distracted, lingering longer than necessary when looking at old photos, folding laundry like she wasn't really in the room. Sophia didn't ask questions. She knew when her mother was carrying something heavy. It had always been just the two of them, and Lillian had never once lied to her. But this was different. This was the first time Sophia had felt that something was being held back. The moment came unexpectedly. It was a Saturday evening, rain tapping against the windows, and Sophia was in the kitchen finishing a grant application while Lillian stood at the sink washing dishes by hand. Without looking up, Sophia said quietly, "I think I know who my father is." Lillian's hands stopped in the water. She didn't move for a full 5 seconds. Then, slowly, she turned off the tap and dried her hands with a towel, her back still facing her daughter. "Say that again," she whispered. Sophia closed her laptop. "I saw him at the summit. I didn't know then. But I think he's the one who's been helping me. The anonymous funding, the research connections, it started after Chicago. I recognized his name in a donor article and then I found him online. His name is Alexander Reed, right?" Lillian turned around, her face pale but calm. Her eyes searched Sophia's, and then something in her seemed to deflate. She nodded once. "Yes." The word fell into the room like a dropped plate. Fragile, final, impossible to ignore. Sophia didn't speak for a moment. She had prepared 1,000 versions of this conversation in her head, but none of them felt right now. Finally, she asked the only thing that mattered. "Did he know about me?" Lillian sat down across from her and let out a slow, shaking breath. "No. Not really. Not then." And so she told her everything. The truth. The love story, the sudden silence, the forged letter, the betrayal not just of a partner but of a future. She told Sophia about the night she gave birth alone, about the years of working double shifts, about the choice to never poison her daughter's life with resentment. She hadn't known the full truth until recently, but she had suspected for a long time that something hadn't added up. And when she saw him at the summit, everything inside her confirmed it. The man she once loved had been lied to, but he had also allowed himself to disappear without a fight. Sophia listened without interrupting. Her face stayed still, but her heart was pounding in her chest like a warning bell. All this time, she had lived without a father, not because he had died, or been unknown, but because he had been tricked. Because he had believed a lie. Because he hadn't checked. The pain wasn't sharp, it was slow and deep, like something being pulled out of her chest thread by thread. "So he knows now," she said finally. "That I'm his daughter." Lillian nodded. "Yes. He found out after the summit. He's the one who funded your program. He's been trying to reach me. I wouldn't let him talk to you. I didn't know if it would help or just hurt more." Sophia stood up and walked to the window. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, arms crossed, watching the rain streak the glass in long, trembling lines. "Why didn't he try harder back then?" she asked. "Why didn't he question it? You were carrying his child. Why wasn't that enough?" Lillian shook her head slowly. "I ask myself that every day. But I think the answer is simple. He was afraid. And maybe too proud. And he let someone else decide his life for him." Sophia didn't respond. That night, she didn't sleep much. She reread everything she could find about Alexander Reed, his early career, his rise in Silicon Valley, his reputation for calculated decisions and emotional distance. She tried to imagine him as a young man, scared and ambitious, and she tried to imagine him now, trying to make amends without knowing how. The next day, she sent him a message. It was short, cautious, and direct. I know who you are. I know what happened. I don't know what I want from you yet. But I think we should talk. She stared at it for a long time before hitting send. Her hands trembled, but her voice stayed steady. Somewhere deep inside her, something old was waking up. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of it. And that was enough to begin. Alexander read the message 5 times before he allowed himself to believe it was real. He was sitting in his office, surrounded by walls of glass and the quiet hum of a world that no longer interested him the way it once had. His phone buzzed with alerts from markets and assistants and meetings he was already late for, but none of it mattered. Not in that moment. The message had come from Sophia. Not Lillian. Not a lawyer. Not a distant cousin. Sophia herself. The girl whose face had haunted him since the night of the summit. The girl who looked at the world with a mind sharper than most and eyes that were half his. She had reached out. The words were cautious and fragile, but they were open. She wanted to talk. He didn't know what to say back. For a man who had built empires with his words, who could sway boardrooms and investors with a single sentence, Alexander found himself paralyzed. There were no instructions for this. No formula. No script. He replied simply, I would be honored to speak with you. Whenever and however you feel ready. It was 3 days before she responded again. He didn't pressure her. He spent the time walking through memories he had long suppressed, forcing himself to sit with the shame. The image of Lillian, alone in a snow-covered hospital. The sound of a child's laugh he had never heard. The birthdays missed. The school projects, the scraped knees, the college applications, all moments he could never reclaim. But he didn't let the guilt break him. He let it teach him. He understood now that redemption was not a single act. It was 1,000 quiet offerings laid out patiently over time. Sophia finally suggested they meet at a park near the university campus she had recently committed to. It was early spring, the kind of day where the trees were beginning to wake and the air carried the first hints of something new. Alexander arrived 15 minutes early. He wore no suit, no watch, no expensive coat. Just a simple sweater and jeans, as if trying to step away from the man he had been and into the man he was trying to become. When she arrived, he saw her before she saw him. She looked like herself, focused, thoughtful, slightly guarded. Her shoulders were squared, her walk steady, her face unreadable. She sat on the bench across from him and folded her hands in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I don't really know how to do this, she admitted finally. Neither do I, he replied softly. But I'm here. She looked at him, her gaze steady. Why didn't you come back? Even after you left, even if the letter was convincing, why didn't you check? Why didn't you try? It was the question that had been burning inside her since the moment she learned the truth. And she deserved an answer. Alexander didn't deflect. He didn't blame his mother or the chaos of his career. He didn't make excuses. Instead, he looked down at his hands and said, I was afraid. And I was selfish. I let one letter dictate everything because it gave me an excuse not to face the possibility of being a father before I was ready. I told myself it was best for you, for your mother, for my career, but the truth is, I was weak. I was young and arrogant, and I thought I could outrun the guilt. But it followed me anyway. Sophia didn't speak for a long moment. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes shimmered faintly in the soft morning light. I don't want a perfect explanation, she said finally. I just want honesty. That's all I can offer you now, he said. And time. However long it takes. I know I don't get to show up 18 years later and expect anything. I just want you to know that I see you now. Fully. And I'm proud of who you are, whether you ever call me father or not." She looked away, blinking fast. The wind rustled the branches above them. For the first time, something inside her loosened, just slightly. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something softer than anger. A space where understanding might grow. They spoke for over an hour. He asked questions, not about school or achievements, but about her. What books she liked. What kind of music she listened to. What made her laugh. And he told her stories, not about money or power, but about the dreams he used to have and the mistakes that shaped him. For the first time, she saw the cracks in his armor. And she realized that the man sitting in front of her wasn't just a figure from her imagination. He was real. Flawed. Trying. At the end of the conversation, she stood up and said, "I'm not ready for anything yet. But I think I'd like to keep talking." He nodded. "Whenever you want. I'll be here." She walked away slowly, the distance between them still large, but no longer infinite. Alexander remained on the bench long after she had gone, the wind brushing through the trees, the sound of the world beginning again. Later that evening, Sophia returned home and found her mother waiting in the kitchen. Lillian looked up, searching her daughter's face for a sign. Sophia didn't say anything right away. She simply walked over, wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, and held on. "He didn't run this time," she said quietly. He listened. And for the first time in years, Lillian allowed herself to believe that maybe healing was possible. Not because the past had changed, but because the future might. The months that followed were not smooth or easy, but they were honest. Sophia and Alexander began meeting regularly, sometimes in public places, sometimes in quiet corners of the city where they could speak without the weight of eyes or expectations. Their conversations were awkward at first, filled with pauses and uncertainty, but beneath that hesitation was something steady, a desire to know, to understand, to build. Alexander never pushed. He never asked to be called Dad. He didn't bring gifts or promises. He simply showed up, again and again, and listened. And slowly, brick by brick, a bridge began to form. He learned about her childhood, not just the milestones, but the quiet moments, the days she and Lillian spent baking in a cold apartment, the nights they read books together under a single flickering lamp. She told him about the teachers who had believed in her, the science projects that had sparked her curiosity, and the hunger she had felt, not just for food, which was sometimes scarce, but for opportunity, for safety, for space to dream. Alexander sat with each story like it was a confession, absorbing every word, mourning the memories he had missed but honoring them just the same. Lillian remained cautious. She didn't interfere, but she didn't engage either. She watched from a distance as Sophia carved out this new connection, always ready to catch her if she fell. There were days when the past rose like a tide inside her, reminding her of the pain, the loneliness, the nights she had cried silently while her daughter slept beside her. But then she would see them, Sophia and Alexander sitting in the park, or walking side by side on a quiet street, and something inside her softened. Not out of forgiveness, not entirely, but out of recognition. People could change. And maybe some wounds weren't meant to be erased, but understood. Everything changed on the night of the National Future Science Award ceremony. The event was held in a grand hall in Washington, D.C., a space built for senators and scholars, not high school students. Yet that night, it was filled with the brightest young minds in the country, each one a flame of possibility. Sophia had been chosen as one of 3 finalists for her groundbreaking research in sustainable water filtration, and her name had been whispered in scientific circles for weeks. Journalists, investors, and university leaders filled the seats, their attention fixed on the stage. Sophia stood backstage, nerves buzzing through her veins. She wore a simple dress, cream-colored, stitched by Lillian herself, and a small pin in the shape of a molecule on her collar. When her name was announced and the crowd rose in applause, she stepped forward into the light with a calm she had never known she possessed. She spoke without notes. I stand here today not as someone who rose from perfect circumstances, but as someone who rose because she was allowed to. Because my mother, a woman who worked 3 jobs and never let go of hope, believed in me when no one else did. Because teachers, mentors, and yes, even silent strangers, opened doors I could never have opened alone. She paused. Her eyes moved through the crowd, stopping for the briefest moment on 2 faces in the front row. Lillian, eyes wide with emotion. And Alexander, hands clasped, looking at her not as a benefactor or a symbol of redemption, but simply and fully as a father. I used to believe that pain was something we carried alone, she continued. That absence meant finality. That silence was the end of the story. But I've learned that sometimes, absence is only a chapter, and silence is the space where truth waits to be spoken. The room was silent. No coughs, no shifting in seats. Just breath, held tight in 1,000 chests. So today, I accept this award not just for myself, she said, her voice steady, but for every girl whose future was ever doubted, for every mother who gave everything without expectation, and for every person who learned that it's never too late to show up. The applause was deafening. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes. But Sophia didn't hear any of it. She stepped down from the stage and walked toward the front row. Lillian stood first, wrapping her daughter in a hug that spoke of 1,000 sleepless nights and 1,000 more moments of pride. And then, slowly, Sophia turned to Alexander. He rose, unsure, uncertain whether he was allowed this. But she stepped forward and opened her arms. He embraced her, carefully, reverently, as though afraid she might vanish. That night, everything changed again. The headlines were glowing: Teen Innovator Captures Nation's Heart. Sophia Brooks, the girl who designed a future. But to her, the moment that mattered most came hours later, in a quiet hotel room where she sat between her mother and her father, eating takeout from paper boxes and laughing at something that wasn't even funny. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't need to. They were building something else now. In the months that followed, Sophia began her freshman year at MIT. Lillian opened a foundation for young single mothers, offering legal aid, housing support, and scholarships. Alexander established the Sophia Brooks Innovation Grant for underprivileged youth in STEM. The 3 of them weren't a traditional family, but they were a family nonetheless, built not on perfection, but on truth, effort, and the choice to keep trying. Some wounds never disappear. But sometimes, they become the place where light gets in. This story isn't just about abandonment or reunion, it's about the quiet, brutal cost of silence and the extraordinary strength it takes to rebuild something that was never given the chance to grow. What makes the ending powerful isn't that everything is magically resolved, but that the characters choose to meet each other in the aftermath of pain, with honesty, humility, and the courage to begin again. Sophia doesn't forgive easily, and she shouldn't. Lillian doesn't forget, but she lets go. And Alexander doesn't expect redemption, he earns the right to be present, step by step. That's what makes the final moments ring true, not perfection, but effort. Not reunion, but reckoning. In the end, the story reminds us that some wounds leave scars, yes, but scars can be strong. They're the proof that healing was possible. And in that, there's beauty.